But I think most works of art have more than one identity, and they have more than the identity of just what the artist wants to say or wants to express. So one of the jobs of a curator or a critic, I think, who's, you know, sometimes the first people in, as it were, is to do something with the work that sort of allows it to be seen with more meanings than the artist might have even intended. So I think the artist both knows what he or she wants to say, and there's something always unknowable about what they're doing, or it wouldn't be art, actually. And what appealed to me about Marcelo's work was that it's music written, but if you don't read music, the only way you can read it, in a sense, is as drawing. So you're reading it as expression.
I think this idea of classical music is not too far away from what I do. It's just some aspects of it probably are different. I think the visual representation of music was, from the beginning, very important to process musical ideas. Without notation, we couldn't be here today in Western music. So there's a very close connection between those two aspects, and probably the different thing that I'm doing is my materials are different. I'm very much noise oriented. I think it was when I saw my father playing the guitar. I was really young, probably 5, 7, and he used to play once a week, Fridays, Saturdays. We are 4 brothers, and he was playing for us, and I was the only one who was really interested in it. And so soon I started playing the guitar, and I studied a little bit, but also I had my friends from the street. It was a nice combination because I had my kind of formal education as a classical guitarist. So that combination of two different worlds was very, very good for me. For example, I never improvised when I was studying in a formal way, and with my friends that was the only way to play, you know, improvisations and things. So a combination of both things. Then I was 18 and I had to decide for what I will do in the future. And I was very interested in architecture. And I finished a technical school, and I was fascinated with working late at night on projects. But at the same time was music, and I decided to go into music. I have my rulers, my pencils, my paper, everything. It's very much like drawing and projecting things in space. And my mind also works in that way, very much in a visual way. So I have some ideas with my sounds, and I first will draw something, a gesture, because it's more immediate.
To the degree that I understand musical notation is that Marcelo himself is frustrated by notation, and he goes beyond that. So he's actually making marks that would try to cause sounds that are just expressive but aren't actually musical per se. So I thought it might be interesting to look at his composition as drawing. I mean, I really started to see them in the way that you look at architectural drawings or botanical drawings, or things that are a little bit outside what you think is the normal idea of what a drawing is, just a representation of something, and you realize that it has these other potentials. And I just got excited by the drawings themselves. So I went back to the visual arts people and said I wasn't going to do a faculty show, and could I do this show? So they said, sure, why not?
Later I met Bruce Ferguson, the dean of the School of the Art, and he had a chance, and I had a chance actually, to talk to him. And then at one point I had the chance to show him the score, and I told him, I finished the score, I finished the piece, and I brought it here, but I probably will not bring it again because it's, you know, it's heavy. I don't want to move it too much. And he saw the score one day, Well, everything is handwritten, pencil, paper, huge paper, 17 by 24, 50 pages of them, extremely dense. And I think he was interested in the visual aspect of it. So next morning he called me and he said, I would like to have an exhibition with that.
I think he was surprised that I wanted to do it. He uses the sheets of music that he uses, strictly to give out to the performers, and the performers use them to perform. Although he's interestingly obsessive enough that he draws all the staffs by hand and that sort of thing. He doesn't use a mass-produced musical compositional sheet. And then he also does these drawings off to the side. I don't know if you saw the notebook, but the notebook has all these drawings and notes and words and sort of references. And to me, actually, the artistic process is always the most interesting part of art.
Many times, the trigger for a piece of music is poetry. So I knew after I got this commission that I had to write a piece for 24 musicians. I selected 24. But I didn't know what to do. I mean, I didn't have any idea yet. And then at that moment, I started reading things. So I found these ideas of abysm. Yes, abyss. And that was something fascinating for me, because it represents two things. One is a kind of a negative aspect of it, yes, like the underworld. That's a very common idea of that word, but there is something more. The idea of abismo or abismos is the unknown. It's the space of. It's the space where you discover new things. And for this piece, I thought, yes, I would like to discover new things. I, of course, will use all the things that I was working on these 5 or 6 years, but also I would like to discover something new. Otherwise, I don't feel the intensity to start working. I imagine a piece from beginning to end with complex sounds or noises. A big fluid, or like a big snake, if you want, moving on an unknown river, transforming all the time. And I like to have that kind of images because it gives me a lot of room to explore.
It's the process that's exciting. I mean, it's the process that's interesting, because you're never quite sure where it's going. I mean, it's unlike, most disciplines are really a reproduction of the law. Like history and other disciplines like that, they reproduce the law. You have a case study, then somebody else adds to it, and then there's a judgment, and then you add to that judgment, and so on. So there's a kind of way in which it's academics reproduce a certain kind of case argument all the way forward. Whereas in the sciences and the arts, I think you actually are both dealing with the subject matter, which is unknown as you're moving forward, and the methodology, which is unknown. You're always trying to find this space where the methodology and the subject matter will come together to be the most forceful. But again, it's not like there's no right or wrong, and you actually don't even know what the result is until you're finished. So the process is really where most artists spend most of their time. I mean, that's, the end product is the thing that other people see, but artists spend all their time in process, I think.
My sounds are noise oriented, but the way I work, it has to do with the traditional approach in a way, because ideas and notation, they have to work together. I don't improvise. I mean, I improvise at home when I work in sounds, and I play all the sounds that I write, but improvisation is not the area where I like to explore music. So when I work with sounds and I found some of them interesting and I found a connection with them, so then it's the next step of composition. And in that step and in that area where you work with notation, it's similar to probably the classical composers. I work with traditional instruments, and it's very important, I know, that in order to communicate the ideas of how to play, I have to develop my own musical notation, and that musical notation should be very clear. That's the way I show my respect to musicians. So I know what to do, but they should also know how to approach a sound that I would like to be produced in an instrument. So I have layers of information sometimes for just one gesture. A sound like this, yes, in a flute. It has so many transformations inside, different aspects, different parameters changing, and you have to describe each one of them. But at the same time, notation should not be too dense that they will not go, they will not really try to get the sound. It should be just the essential information, so they can enjoy also the connection with the sound. And I think the process of the history of Western music is also the history of notation of sounds. And when more refined the notation was, more refined ideas you could produce. Some other composers did already some work on these sounds. The most important for me were Lachenmann and Charrino. They both have worked in this direction before. But I was trying to find my own way of doing it. There are two things in those new graphic notations, yes? First of all, the gestural aspect of the representation of a sound, it has two ideas. One is that the player could follow not only the information in terms of acoustical transformation of the sound, yes, but also as an image that in a kind of obscure or strange way will have an impact in his way of playing. So sometimes you have little lines that are going from very, very quiet contour to very complex and nervous contour. And there is a transformation of the sound that the performer knows how to do it. But at the same time, there's some kind of extra information. There is certain kind of energy necessary to produce some sounds. And it's not only the parameters, it's an attitude with the instrument, and it's an attitude with themselves that they have to achieve. Sometimes it's tension, sometimes it's complete detachment.
One thing, obviously, that I did in this show was to bring in that Richard Archwager sculpture, which is essentially an empty book, or it's a representation of a big book, but an empty book. So it seems to me that it symbolizes the idea of reading, and reading is an open-ended interpretive process that, you know, if you read Moby Dick, you read it differently than I do. And also you don't read it all the way through necessarily. And, you know, there's all these ways that we now know, you know, about the way in which reading is received, that it's not received on a one-to-one basis. I just write something, you get the meaning. It's much more complicated than that. So the book, I think, symbolized that idea of reading. And then Marcelo himself took the occasion, having seen the images on the wall, the music compositional pages on the wall, to do a drawing underneath. And the drawing underneath in color really was meant, I think, to try to show the forces of the composition, which meant that he was already doing an interpretation of his own work. It was an interpretation of the drawings with another drawing.
Yannis Xenakis was probably the first composer who tried to put together ideas of connection between visual images and sounds. He wrote this fantastic piece in the 50s called Metastasis for orchestra. And everything was coming out of visual representations. The first mass of sound producing glissandi was produced in this piece. and everything is a translation of those straight lines into an orchestra. After that, Julio Estrada, a Mexican composer who studied with him, also he worked in that way. Yes, drawing curves. The difference in my approach is that instead of representing every parameter in the curves, I represent a more general idea of the music. I call it curve of energy. So what I did in the exhibition is I had a black line throughout the whole 4 walls, and on that line I drew with 30 colors the curve of energy. And the colors represent timbre, and the transformation of texture represent the transformation of the sound in real time. It's not systematic. It's not something that I do it exactly here, I do this. No, it's just trying to put together the idea of music, sound with image.
You know, music has a tremendously important role sometimes in musical theater, obviously, but particularly in film. And one doesn't always think about the connection between music and visual arts, and yet, in a certain way, they both use each other as a metaphor. Music is always sort of talking about color and hues and certain kinds of expressive terms that come right out of painting or right out of the visual arts. And visual arts are always trying to talk about, not always, but often trying to achieve the state of music. So this kind of collision happened there.
First, I work only with traditional instruments. So I don't use new instruments. I don't use electronics. I use violins, flutes, oboes, bassoons, all the traditional instruments from the orchestra. But what I'm trying to do is trying to break the identity of the instrument. So I know the tradition of the instrument. I know how that instrument could sound. I know how to write for the instrument in a traditional way, but I'm trying to forget everything. And I'm trying to play myself, and I go into the instrument like going into a dark room. So trying to get something original, but not original for others, yes, but for me, like I heard for the first time that sound. The piece was performed, this piece, Para el Encuentro en los Abismos. It's a commission from the Ensemble Intercontemporain, this French ensemble, and it was performed in December. And 24 musicians, great response in part of them. Some of them could have been a little bit resistant to produce the sounds or to do what I wanted, but most of them were very open. Some of them were incredibly open, and I'm very happy. But I think I went twice. I went first when I finished the piece. I went to Paris and I worked with them first, and then I came back for the rehearsals and worked with them again. You will think that the best musicians, the well-trained musicians, are probably the best to produce the music. It could be. But sometimes, because all the training they have and the tradition they have, they imagine that they were playing the flute or the violin since they were 5 years old in the same way, yes, respecting so many things, for example, a particular quality of sound. Here I come and I transform completely the thing, as I try to forget about all that tradition and trying to find a new quality of sound that is exploring more the noise aspect of it. And there is a resistance sometimes to do that. The second one is the techniques. Techniques they use for the bow, for example, to produce the most beautiful, quote-unquote, sound in classical music. No, they have to work in a different way. They have to move the bow in hundreds of ways. Pressure, speed, angle of the bow, etc. They have to be very, very, very much like painters, because the bow is like the brush. And many times I find resistance in part of the musicians, but at the same time, many times I find that after that crisis, the confrontation with the new way of playing, there is a new approach, kind of a revelation of how to approach that music. I started working with in this new direction, yes, with complex sounds and noises. After I was already working with traditional sounds for a while, yes, and I always had this interest in those sounds that we couldn't define, yes. But I did something, I went back to my first experience in music, which was play first, analyze later. So I played it, the guitar was my instrument. I did everything first with the guitar. And many things that I didn't know why they sound good or bad. Just I played it, yes. When I started working with new sounds, the first instrument that I used was the flute. And I didn't have the idea to work with new sounds. It just started in a very natural way. I never played the flute. I rented the flute. I had the idea of working with something different, but I didn't know what. And I started doing things like this. Yes. So you hear, you first of all, there is no pitch content on those sounds. There's no definite pitch, yes. No notes. You hear only air sounds, yes. But those air sounds have frequencies, yeah. And they have also a clear contour in terms of gestures, yes. This new sound that I found, I always try to find correspondences between different sounds, different families or quality of sounds. There's this scratch sound in the strings that is very, very intense distortion of the string sound. And I wanted to find something similar in the wind instruments. And finally I found this sound. I call it the buzzing cluster. And I don't know if it was done before, or probably yes, but I use it in connection with these other sounds to create really complex gesture. And it was the most difficult sound to be produced in my last piece. So the name is buzzing cluster, and it's difficult for the wind instrument players, because it requires some particular way of working with your lips that is actually completely against the whole tradition of how to produce a sound in a wind instrument, in this case in a brass instrument. So it's very difficult to produce it because of that. see, each instrument produces its own gamut of sounds and gestures, and this is something interesting for me. It's not the instrument, it's not me, but it's the relationship between both. That's why you cannot translate what you do in one instrument to another one trying to get the same result. Each one will have a way of dancing with you, you know, and I'm interested in that. I'm open to see my reaction to every instrument.